So let's talk about the sun. So I saw this quote in a study and I thought it sums up really nicely our kind of good cop, bad cop approach to the sun. It says, each day Apollo's fiery chariot makes its way across the sky, bringing life-giving light to the planet. For the ancient Greeks and Romans, Apollo was the god of medicine and healing, as well as of sun and light, but Apollo could bring sickness as well as cure. So we know that sunlight is essential for all life on Earth. We know that it's essential for our biology, and we wouldn't survive very long without it, both directly for its direct health benefits, and also indirectly for providing our entire food supply and little things like that. But in the last few decades, there's been a kind of focus on this negative effect of sun on melanoma risk, on skin cancer risk. And while it's an important issue, and we should definitely consider that, we don't want to let it eclipse all of those benefits that the sun has on the other areas of our physiology. So while in some cases we see a slight increase in the risk from melanoma, we also see a huge decrease in the risk from all other forms of disease in general, whether it's metabolic, whether it's heart disease. We see broadly positive effects of sunlight. And so sun exposure has a complex relationship with the immune system. There are certain parts of the spectrum that may suppress areas of our immune system and other parts that may boost it. One area is vitamin D, but it certainly shouldn't be limited to talking about vitamin D only. With regards to vitamin D, it regulates our innate and our adaptive response, as well as a whole load of gene expression. Getting enough vitamin D also increases our Treg cells, and our Treg cells are our regulatory side of our immune system. What they do is they produce various anti-inflammatory cytokines like interleukin 10. This is able to dampen down our Th1, Th2, Th17 responses, and so it's able to calm down the immune system. And this is key because the immune system can't react to everything. It has to have a certain level of tolerance, and this Treg system is one of the main ways in which we achieve that tolerance level. And so vitamin D is also essential for what's called the Th1-TR1 switch. This is where we end up producing less Th1 cells and more TR1 cells, TR1 being a form of regulatory cell. And this TR1 cell is particularly linked with the regulation of that NLRP3 inflammasome. So this is probably one of the main ways in which it has its broadly anti-inflammatory effect, reducing interleukin 6, interleukin 17, TNF-alpha, NF-kappa beta, etc. So this again speaks to this idea that it can reduce that low-grade inflammation, those elevated levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines. So that's not all that vitamin D does. It also stimulates the production of cathelicidin. And cathelicidin is what's called an antimicrobial peptide. It's part of the defensin family, and it may be particularly relevant to the lungs. So cathelicidin, it has a broadly antimicrobial action against various bacteria, viruses and fungi. We don't know if it has an effect on SARS-CoV-2. It'd be interesting if that research is ever done, but it may be especially useful for things like pre-existing infections, or when somebody gets viral pneumonia. Often bacterial pneumonia comes along as well, and so having a higher level of vitamin D may be protective, if not directly, also indirectly in that situation. So it also regulates the RAS system by suppressing renin. This means there's going to be a lower level of angiotensin 2, and probably this is the main reason why it lowers blood pressure. So there are mixed viewpoints on ACE2 expression, and if you remember back to the beginning of this talk, increased ACE2 expression may be a good thing or a bad thing. We're still not quite sure, but there's evidence to suggest that vitamin D may be able to increase the ACE2 expression. And so Dr. Rhonda Patrick was putting forward a study done on mice that was showing that perhaps vitamin D optimized the level of ACE2 rather than just boosting it. So this would obviously be a good thing and protective against various forms of acute lung injury. Whereas on the other side, Chris Masterjohn was looking at a few studies that were showing that vitamin D could indiscriminately boost ACE2 without necessarily this optimization. And so it's still not clear whether this is going to have a positive or a negative effect. Again, these are rodent studies, so it's quite difficult to determine whether this is we're gonna see this same effect in humans. And in any case, there is some conflicting evidence about the level of ACE2 expression in any case. For example, Chris rightly points out that some studies have shown that in SARS-CoV-1 models, excess ACE2 expression was really led to negative outcomes in rodent models. But then again, children have high levels of ACE2 and they don't seem to be affected here. So again, I'll reiterate that there seems to be a lot more things to uncover and nail down before we can say definitely one way or the other. In any case, I appreciated Chris's conservative advice, the precautionary principle. It's a good thing to stick to, especially when things are changing so quickly. But then he came out later on and made another video about vitamin D, a preprint study. And this was looking at differences in vitamin D levels and the differences in people with COVID-19. And it showed that people with less vitamin D were doing less well, according to this study. So people with vitamin D insufficiency had a 10 times risk for moving to a more severe expression of COVID-19. Now, obviously, this was observational, and so it's difficult to say what is causing what. But certainly the data looked interesting and worthy of further study. So based on that, Chris was talking about a recommendation of aiming for 30 nanograms per milliliter vitamin D. And so to that end, the recommendation seemed to be getting vitamin D from sun, getting vitamin D adequacy, but not going crazy with supplements. Okay, so what about other effects of vitamin D here? Multiple epidemiological studies in adults and children have demonstrated that vitamin D deficiency is associated with increased risk and greater severity of infection, particularly of the respiratory tract. So again, this seems encouraging to read. Obviously, we want to take this with a pinch of salt because this did not look at the current COVID-19 situation. This was looking at other immune challenges. And so obviously, we can't say for sure that this is going to transfer to this new virus. But what we can look at is the totality of evidence. It seems more than likely that vitamin D is going to be very beneficial in this situation. And also the fact that if we look back to the original SARS-CoV-1 pandemic, that turned up around about November in the Northern Hemisphere. And so that was at a time where vitamin D would have been very low among the population. Also, this current outbreak, SARS-CoV-2, that also turned up in December. And so again, we're looking at low vitamin D levels. And it seems like coronaviruses in general have a seasonality to them, but time will only tell, and more research and digging into this to find out just how effective vitamin D might be in this situation. So vitamin D is often found to be lower in elderly and obese populations. Particularly the elderly have a decreased capacity to make vitamin D in their skin. And this may be a particular problem in northern Italy. I was quite surprised to find that Italy has a higher vitamin D deficiency level than many other European countries, which is surprising because there's generally more sun here. This may also be a problem for African Americans. African Americans seem to have been hit disproportionately with COVID-19. This may be a vitamin D issue, but it may also be a metabolic issue because that population tends to be more predisposed to diabetes. Then in Stockholm, many of the COVID-19 deaths have been Somalians, and that's been really disproportionate to the population there. Again, this is correlation and not causation. There could be many other factors at play here, social factors, cultural factors, whatever. But it looks like in many of these situations, vitamin D may turn out to be playing an essential role in our protection against this new virus. So what about the other effects of the sun? And there are many, and this is one argument for not just trying to resolve vitamin D problems with supplements. When we get out in the sun, we get all sorts of different other effects that we're only just beginning to uncover. One of those is on our circadian rhythm. Our circadian rhythm is our day-night cycle. Ideally, we would be aligned with the natural cycle, so we would go to bed when it's dark and get up when it's light. Obviously, with the advent of technology, this has completely thrown us out, and we no longer follow a circadian rhythm, especially with additions such as shift work. But more and more, the evidence is suggesting that this has a really important role in immune dysregulation. I'll read this quote out. "A growing body of evidence supports a key role for the circadian clock in the regulation of immune functions and inflammatory responses." So again, we see melatonin. Now, I've included it here because sun exposure seems to be really important for optimizing our melatonin level. As we saw previously, important regulatory effect on the innate and the adaptive immune response, as well as the inhibition of the NLRP3 inflammasome. It has powerful effects on the mitochondria and, as mentioned before, significant effects on metabolic health. Just to go into a bit more detail here, it improves insulin sensitivity, leptin sensitivity, hepatic lipolysis, and as well carbohydrate usage. So it seems to have a beneficial effect on many different aspects of our metabolic health. Other immune effects: the sun has many other positive effects. For example, sunlight directly energizes T cells, enhancing motility around the body. And there are many other positive effects on the comorbidities that we were looking at. So diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, obesity, renal diseases, lung diseases. The general research on the sun is that this has broadly positive effects on many of these different disease processes. So in summary, we should really be aiming to get more sun. We're spending most of our time indoors, but we evolved to be outdoors, and so we need to get more sun. Obviously, we need to do that carefully. We shouldn't be burning. We should be building up protection slowly throughout the year. In this respect, morning and evening sunlight is protective against that hot midday sun, and we can always take shade and use clothing to avoid getting burnt or getting too much sun exposure. I think it's fair to say that we can rethink sun cream. In 1930, the chance of developing melanoma was 1 in 1,500. In 2007, that had risen to 1 in 32. And so I think sun cream came on the market in 1928. And while obviously, while it's not fair, I think, to point the finger at sun cream as a causative agent, I think it's fair to say that sun cream does give us a false sense of security. And so we should perhaps think about limiting sun exposure by seeking shade, or by using clothing, or by getting morning and evening sun before we reach for the sun cream. Also, it's worth thinking about our origins. I'm from England, and so I have quite pale skin, and now I'm living in Italy, so I have to pay a little bit of attention about spending long periods in the sun.